Hi, folks. Welcome to one more episode of Supply Chain Show. Today, I have a special guest, Steve Wills. Steve Wills is a legend when it comes to the procurement training space, not just in UK, globally. Me and Steve have worked in a lot of conferences in Ukraine, Musk. We do a lot of gigs together. And his style of teaching is known for his humor and how basically he relates the theory with the practice. Most importantly, I think he has an enormous experience in working as a CEO for London Olympics 2012, which is, I think, one of the greatest opportunities you can have in your procurement career, right? I'm learning a lot from Steve. He's, kind of my mentor as well. We're working on a lot of courses together, and I'm really pleased to have Steve on board. But before I give it to Steve, let's discuss the topic. The topic, somebody asked me on my LinkedIn that please explain the difference between, let's call it a public procurement, and then let's call it normal corporate procurement. What are the challenges, success factors, and definitions? So this is what we're going to talk about, Steve. Steve, welcome on board. How are you, sir, today?
Yeah, hi everybody, and thank you for that great introduction. Legend is always good. I'm very happy to be called, described as a legend. Yeah, it's great to be here, and thank you for that very warm welcome. And looking forward to the next 20 minutes discussing this topic.
So, with your experience as a consultant and a trainer and a practitioner as a CPO, you have worked with the government bodies. I mean, you couldn't get more, let's call it, politically and structurally complicated when you manage things like Olympics. It's like a multi-billion-dollar project, global coordination. So let's start with the basic definition. Okay, what is the difference between, let's call it, a corporate procurement and the public procurement? Let's start with that first.
Yeah, well, okay. So the differences, I guess, are becoming more and more blurred as more and more PLC companies are becoming more and more strategic and professional with their procurement functions. So there was a time, though, to answer your question, there was a time when I think PLC companies were thought of as going for cheaper outcomes, looking only at the price and, not being, shall we say, transparent or fair. I think that over time that has changed. I think the lines have blurred with public procurement. I think the transparency, I think the look at total cost of ownership rather than price, looking at sustainability, looking at, working with companies in partnership is much more the aim of both PLC and public procurement. So in public procurement, of course, they have their emphasis, their focus on being very transparent with their supply base. And I guess PLC is probably less so. It doesn't have to reveal quite as much as public procurement. But I would say in the other areas, there's a lot more overlap now with PLC and public procurement.
No, so thinking as a outsider who paid taxes, and we pay taxes in UK, right? You would be always very critical about a public organization. Let's call it NHS. Always under fire on their end, right? Let's take about any other, let's call it, councils in UK who was always under pressure. Where they're spending money and stuff, right? So that challenge for me is obvious, but the thing is they have to invest that that money, and I think so. That's one challenge. The second thing is how they select their suppliers and how they select their vendors and how they go through the, let's call it, a complicated process of RFQ or tendering to arrive to a decision which looks neutral to basically don't get under fire from the taxpayers, right? So expand on not just on these two challenges I mentioned. Expand any other challenges you think is kind of unique to the public procurement people.
Yeah, exactly as you say. I mean, we the taxpayer element of it does bring a different dimension to public sector procurement. As you say, that visibility, that transparency, that accountability, the accountability to demonstrate, value for money. And it's not completely devoid in PLC. There is a lot of pressure from internal stakeholders to do the same. They're looking to scrutinize all the time. Have we sourced the right partners to bring solutions to our business, not just for today, but of course for the future. This isn't a one and done. This is something where procurement are thinking about, what's going to be happening, particularly with the world in chaos at the moment with pandemics, in the next 2 to 3 years. So we're thinking ahead, we're thinking about the right solutions. And, public sector accountability, because it's taxpayers' money, does shine a very big spotlight on making sure that you can demonstrate evidence, that you can provide evidence of certainly consulting with internally with stakeholders, both the company stakeholders or the organisation stakeholders, particularly as you mentioned NHS, but in defence, the Ministry of Defence is another big organisation where you're dealing with internal stakeholders. But also, if you're doing big projects, you may have communities, you may have external stakeholders to consult with as well. And obviously, it's a very challenging piece of procurement's work, this consultation, because on one hand, obviously, you're there to gather people's feedback, gather people's input, but on the other hand, you've got a job of work to do to also get across to people, let's say, that changes for the better, that what you're doing, will bring benefits. So you're not there just as a sounding board, somebody to receive information. You're also there to give them information that might affect their views. And you're not just sometimes we get called a support function. You're actually a leadership function, in the sense of putting across the reasons, and it might be that we can't continue with the existing solution because of financial, budgetary constraints. So that was certainly a factor in the Olympics. We didn't have endless money. We had budgetary constraints, and secondly, we were regenerating, in a lot of cases. We were regenerating quite depressed communities. So the community, weren't always aware of the benefits that they were getting. So you're there to put across the improvements, the benefits, and explain to them what the project will deliver for them, which might affect their thinking as well. So you're not there completely in a passive role. You're there in a proactive role to get that message across. And I don't think that's completely different in PLC. You've got stakeholders, you've got people in the business who quite enjoy spending money, and they've got their own view about who they want to spend money with, and how they want to go about spending money. So you're there to work in that collaborative way with stakeholders, both public sector and PLC.
Yeah, well, I know you said a few times that it also applied this accountability and communication to the PLCs and stuff. But I don't think that they are as transparent with their about the
No.
practices about the spend and how they select suppliers, right? And how they manage suppliers as public procurement is, which is, I think, a credit to public procurement. The example I'm going to give you is the recent shenanigans of Boohoo. I don't know you heard or not. The big e-commerce retailer, they got plenty of bad press because of the supplier they have selected paying under the wage, paying illegal workers in UK and stuff, which would have never happened in the public procurement, right? So the point I'm saying, there's kind of something to learn the PLCs, which they can somehow learn that from the public procurement. I mean, that's what I think. What's your view?
Yeah, so this is not the first, and I'm sure it won't be the last in PLC, because for decades now we've had Nike, shown us as the case study for how not to go about working with subcontractors, who don't pay the full rate, who use, shall we call it, child labour, and sweatshops and so on. We've seen footage of Apple, of all people, using sweatshops in Indonesia, people falling asleep at the desks, under the tables. So, we've got situations in agriculture, where people are not, are picking fruit, and are not being paid the, shall we call it, certainly the legal minimum wage. So, there are cases, and it reflects badly when those cases happen, but it's not all cases. So, and as I've said, there's a lot of, for every example you may share with me, I could share 10 with you, of procurement best practice, where they do look into tier 2, tier 3 supply chain companies, and they get those evaluated for sustainability and ethical procurement. So it isn't, I'm not saying it's an isolated incident, and it does happen. By the way, in the UK at the moment, we've got a lot of questions being asked of public procurement. Decisions were made during the pandemic, which are very questionable, about selection of companies for for items, supply chain items,
like vaccine and all that.
Yeah, so which have bypassed the public procurement process. So you can find, shall we say, bad examples in both areas. But I can also show you 10 examples for everyone you show me of best practice, where best practice is observed. So we shouldn't just use one bad practice and say that's representative of all PLC procurement practices. It's not all about being, as I say, price focused, ignoring the ethical and the sustainable element to it. And there's certainly a lot of the, shall we say, a lot of the best practices in both public procurement and PLC, are shared between both.
Good. Now I have a tricky question for you, actually. The tricky question, which is outside the boundaries of UK, right? I mean, because SCMDOJO followers are from globally, subcontinent, Africa, USA, etc., right? I was born and raised in Pakistan. If you think about any, let's call it corruption related ranking globally, you will find Pakistan, few other countries in top 3, top 5 always, something like that. So, and this is where the government officials always get accused of kickbacks, whatever, things kind of that, this kind of stuff, right? So, which is happening. I think the countries are maturing, world is developing, transparency is coming, accountability is coming. And those, let's call it those stage countries without naming names, where there is a, let's call it on record high level of corruption, will get better, no doubt about it, right? We just need to give time. So the question is following. So as an advisor who have worked in both, both private PLC and public procurement, what are the top 3 suggestions you will give? Like, if you are into any government related, any country, right? India, Pakistan, South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, wherever, right? You are into public procurement. This would be my suggestion. Top 3 suggestions you can give to increase that transparency and accountability.
Yeah, so we know it happens. We know that, and by the way, it happens, everywhere. Again, we shouldn't just be focusing on one part of the world or certain parts of the world. It happens by degrees. Some of it. I was in before lockdown. I was in South Africa. And I followed the finance minister to speak. I followed the finance minister to, and after all this time, he was still telling stories of corruption, fraud, mismanagement of funds. It just seems to me that lessons are never made, never learned, rather. I guess my advice is that firstly, do you want to be transparent? Do you want to be credible as a leader? Do you want to be seen? Because most government ministers, want to be popular, don't they? They want to be popular. They want to be elected. They want to be seen as, the nation's leader. So certainly for that side of it, you should be able to demonstrate your credibility, your own personal credibility. And so firstly, there's got to be a willingness and a desire on the in what we'll call them, let's just call them your stakeholders for the moment, because you might feel it's hopeless, and I get this all the time. You might feel it's hopeless, and who are you? You're just a procurement officer, and you can't stop this. But you have to find the the light at the end of the tunnel, the reason why these people should be seen as demonstrating ethical values. It's from a popularity point of view. It's from a leadership point of view. It could be from a re-election point of view. So you have to start with a narrative that appeals to them to say, do we want to be an ethical procurement function? Sort of yes or no, really. And secondly, obviously, there's lots of benefits of that, not just in how you can market that to the population, but also from a budgeting point of view. From as you say, a transparency point of view. You can use audit. Obviously, you can work closely with audit teams, but I don't think it's the case that procurement themselves single-handedly can cut out corruption and fraud, or else they would have done it by now. But I think it's much more, the principles of procurement. Following the principles and the values of procurement is that it's from a leadership point of view, it's from a business or an organization benefits point of view, you know, and it's much more about not the short term, it's much more about the long term, isn't it? It's the longer term benefits here. But I don't think we should be under any illusion that this is just one part of the world. You know, by lesser degrees, it happens everywhere.
Yeah.
You know, people get, I mean, I've seen it all my life. You know, people come in, there might not be brown paper envelopes with lots of cash, but I've seen people connected to, you know, they might be a finance director that I'm working for who's connected to a big consultancy. In fact, the big consultancy put him in the job. You know, I won't name names, but, you know, I've had that where a consultancy company have brought forward a finance director and he's now my boss. And obviously he wants that business to go back to that consultancy company.
Yeah.
So just because they're not receiving big bundles of cash doesn't mean that there's influence or persuasion techniques going on. And I think that the narrative, the message, you know, it's all about us as influencers. Can we influence that guy to behave differently? And can we demonstrate the benefits to them of their, you know, of their career? It's not about a short-term benefit. It's about their long-term credibility as a leader.
Sure.
So that's my view on that.
That's perfect. Last question before we wrap up. So for the new people, right, who are want to be in a procurement, do you see any preferential advice for them saying no? What is your advice? Say start with PLC and then move to procurement, public procurement, or if you are starting with public procurement, you have to do X, Y, Z to be in PLC, you know, or procurement, right? So give some, let's call it, points to watch for the young professionals, which is the followers.
So firstly, let's just differentiate between public procurement. There's policy public procurement. And people there very rarely do any procurement or supply chain management at all. You know, it's policy, it's work, but it's a very, if I can say, very sexy reason why people might want to join the policy side of public procurement, because they're working with the ministers, the big politicians.
Yeah.
But they're setting policy. And this is my point. You need to, if you work for the NHS that you've mentioned, you're in a supply chain management role, which you know very well. So if you work for NHS, you are what I would call getting your hands dirty. Some of my colleagues call it getting into the weeds. You are actually doing a job. You're not just policy setting. So my advice is get your hands dirty, get into a job, NHS, Ministry of Defence, transport, education. So these are all public procurement, you know, departments, but they're actually supply chain management and real hands-on procurement. If you can't get into public, and public sector is, stating the obvious, political, you know, that there are politics, and something that can frustrate some people. I've seen some people who like to make progress quickly, and they get a little frustrated with public sector. So then you've got PLC, where you can make a difference. You're right across the company. If you're an influencer and you've got good persuasion and you're bright, and you understand the business, and each business is different, of course. Every time you go into a company, they tell you it's different here. You know, automotive is different to pharmaceuticals. So how they do things is quite different. So to summarize, I would say get some experience. Definitely get experience. Get your hands dirty doing the job. Go to PLC companies, GlaxoSmithKline, pharmaceuticals, Ford, Jaguar, Land Rover, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, the Japanese companies, you know, working just in time, lean. You mentioned fashion a moment ago. Zara, Marks and Spencer's, you know, they're all very, very different. Get experience of actual supply chain and how procurement dovetails into that. The supermarket chains, you know, incredibly fast, incredibly complex supply chains. So get your hands dirty. You know, for me, the policy setting of public procurement, public sector is a very different thing again. And what I find is people can be very detached from understanding how supply chains work if they're in the policy side. But, you know, there's advantages and disadvantages of all of these things. But my view is if you like change, if you like making a difference, get into PLC. If you like, shall we say, a more complex environment, then it's probably MOD, NHS, you know, huge organisations, you know, making changes more difficult in those organisations. But, you know, when you do make the change, it's very rewarding. And then there's the policy setting, which is different again.
Steve, I wish I could have asked this question at the start, right? Because that is excellent summary of how you have differentiated the difference between the, let's call it, the policy maker, which is not really a procurement if you are in a government body, except the, as you said, Ministry of Defense, NHS, where it's more supply chain, you have to buy a lot of stuff to consume it. And then the difference between, as you said, you know, the complexity of the procurement because of, you know, politics is involved. And if you want to get the hands dirty, all the companies you listed, start from there and move. I think anyway, so I can mention folks in at the start or in my comments that please watch till the end because the golden content is actually at the end. So I'm sure we can keep talking about it, but I think, thank you very much for your time, sharing the experience. This is one of the highly requested topic, which I don't know much about. Actually, I learned myself as well. And I'm going to tag you as well. It will be published in a few weeks' time. And I would say thank you very much, Steve, for sharing experience.
Pleasure, right? As always.
Yeah, okay. People go and follow him. Check out Procurement Central if you're looking for big grand courses. Me and Steve work together as well, and we do some workshops, 2-day workshops, 3-day workshops. So please talk to Steve. And as I always say, the usual like, share, subscribe if you like what we're doing. Keep it simple, keep it real, and ciao. Bye-bye.
So if you like this video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and leave your comments below.